Well, it's wonderful to be here with you today, Matt. You and I share a fascination with these high stakes moments which we can get it right, get it wrong. But often when we're caught off guard, how to manage ourselves better is the subject of your brilliant book, which I've let is behind you and it's right here.
I love it.
Think Faster, Talk Smarter. I loved it. It's pacey, it's personal, it's incisive, and it's practical. I'm already using it and changing the way I think and act in these different situations. And I love the fact that you compare speaking extemporaneously to jazz. And you say, I quote, it's like improvising, trying to get and stay in the groove with others around us, in contrast to perhaps classical music, which is all about precision. And those are subjects both close to my heart. And I love that analogy. And that's that improvisation spirit is going to be what we're going to focus on today in this conversation. So welcome to the show.
David, I am thrilled to be here with you. And I'm so honored that you take value from the work I did. I appreciate that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's frame the conversation. And I'm feeling a bit self-conscious and self-aware because you might spring a few surprises in this conversation just to test me, practice what we preach, as it were. But give us a sense of these moments that catch us off guard. Give us some examples of where they show up at work.
Well, I actually believe most of our communication is spontaneous. It's not planned. There are very few communication events that we actually plan for. Presentations, pitches, meetings with agendas. Most of what we do at work is spontaneous. Someone asks you a question, asks for feedback. You need to introduce yourself. You need to fix a faux pas. The projector doesn't work. All of these things are in the moment communication, and often they carry high stakes with them. And so we need to learn to feel more comfortable and confident in those moments, because certainly the ramifications of what happens in those high stakes moments can mean a lot for our careers, for our relationships, for our own self-worth.
And what if you're one of these people who's perhaps nervous, bit edgy, or perhaps has even over-prepared? We've seen that many times. What happens when you're caught off guard? And I guess it could be, as you say, there's some technology not working, fingers crossed it doesn't happen now, or somebody asks you a difficult question, or they're grumpy. What typically goes through people's minds as that happens?
Well, so many of us feel the intense pressure of the moment, right? So anxiety looms large, where we feel great fear in those moments. We also want to respond in the best way we can. We want to be perfect. We want to give the best answer, the most insightful feedback. We want to be really interesting in small talk. And that's a lot of pressure. And finally, many of us feel threatened in these circumstances. You ask me a challenging question, I feel threatened. I feel like my authenticity, my expertise is on the line. All of these, anxiety, the desire to be perfect, this threat that we feel, all of those work against us responding. And I've created a methodology that was born out of necessity from our students at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, where I teach. And it applies not just to them, but to everybody. But the first 4 steps of the 6 steps are all about mindset and approach. And we have to manage anxiety, focus on connection rather than trying to be right. And we need to see these things as opportunities. And when we begin to flip those switches, all of a sudden, we can really be in the moment and respond as needed rather than in our heads, distancing ourselves from that moment.
Absolutely. We're going to dig into that brilliant method as we talk. Before you get to that stage of being in that situation, given the stresses we're under at work, home life, personal issues, whatever it is, how do you get yourself in a reasonable state generally, even before you've come to those moments? Because the reason I ask that is I've come across people who have various techniques, some of which are really obvious what they're doing, which is not that natural. Come on to that as well. But they're so uptight before they start that it becomes a little bit formulaic. How do you get yourself, if you like, into a state generally where you are more able to apply the methods that you clearly and eloquently set out?
Well, so it's counterintuitive, right? There are lots of counterintuitive notions of the book. The big ones, the first 2 are, 1, that you can actually get better at spontaneous speaking. Many of us feel like I'm just born this way. I don't have the gift of gab, and that's not true. You can absolutely get better at your communication. And I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it with people I teach and I coach. But the other one, to answer your question, is that we actually, and it's highly ironic, but you actually have to prepare to be spontaneous. There are things we can do to set ourselves up to do better. And, going back to what you mentioned at the beginning, this notion of jazz, jazz musicians aren't just playing random notes. No, they're actually playing chord progressions that they have practiced and know well. An athlete is doing drills that they have gone over and over again in the moment as the situation dictates. So preparation, both doing the work, doing drills, if you will, but also preparation mentally are the key to success, I think, in many things in life, but especially spontaneous speaking.
To avoid the pun, well, I'm not going to use the pun. Let's drill down further then. You talked about sport, you talked about music. What sort of preparation can you do, if you like, so you know where to turn where something surprising happens? Give us a little sense of that.
Right. So let's take a job interview as an example, if you will, but any spontaneous situation you could plug in here. So in a job interview, I know you're going to ask me questions. I don't know what those questions are, but I know a few things about those questions. One, they're going to be about my experience. Two, they're going to be about my fit for the job. And three, you're trying to assess what type of person am I? So I can go into the situation. It's not completely spontaneous, right? You're not going to ask me a question about the moon if I'm interviewing to be a program manager in a high-tech company. So I have some ideas. And because of that, I can actually do a couple things to prepare. One, I can stockpile some examples that demonstrate the qualities that I want to convey. It's much like a chef who might pre-chop and saute and prepare all these different ingredients. And that helps me. I can also practice. I can ask friends to ask me questions. I can think of questions myself. I can use generative AI. I can say, interviewing for a program manager at a fintech company, what are 3 reasonable questions? So that's how I prepare. I stockpile relevant examples, not intending to use all of them in exactly the same way, but I have thought through them. And I have practiced answering some questions. Now, a big part of what I teach is to then leverage structure. You don't just randomly list information. You put it in a logical structure. And if you have a logical structure, which is essentially like a recipe, I have the ingredients and I've done it before, chances are, if I were a cook, I would make a pretty good meal out of that. So there's a lot we can do to prepare ourselves to feel better in those circumstances. And that was just for an interview, but you could do almost exactly the same thing in a situation you expect to give feedback or to make small talk. It can help.
I'm salivating given that idea of a cook and a recipe.
I'm a lousy cook, but I understand that I am better when I prepare things in advance and follow a recipe.
Say more about the structure, because in the book you have a number of examples of structures that work. And I'm particularly keen on how you not only use them, but use them naturally.
Yes, that's an added part of the process. So to me, structure is nothing more than a logical connection of ideas, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our brains are not wired for lists of information. In fact, I'll ask you, David, how many items do you need to buy from the grocery store before you actually have to write them down? If you're like me, it's 4. Anything over 4, I have to write it down. Do you have a great memory, or can you do more than 4 or 5? Before you have to write them down?
It depends on the day. I could probably, I literally just did it about 2 hours ago and I counted 6. And I think my wife nearly fainted as I came in with all 6. So
good for
normally
you.
Must be close to 4.
So you are far better than I. But the point is this, our brains aren't wired for that. That's hard. You're probably walking around the store remembering also, keep repeating
fear.
them. So you don't forget
fear, complete fear of her getting annoying her.
Exactly. So having a logical structure helps. Our brains are wired for structure. In fact, we call it episodic memory, episodes, structured bits of information. So the example of a structure I always use is one that we all know: problem, solution, benefit. If you've ever seen an advertisement, they always start with some issue, challenge, or problem, the product or service that remedies it, and then what the benefit is or how you buy it, etc. So it's problem, solution, benefit is a very standard structure. So there are structures you can apply in lots of different circumstances. The whole second part of the book, as you know, takes a specific spontaneous speaking situation and applies a structure to it. Not to say that this is the only way to respond, but this is a way. And if you know you have a way to do it, it reduces some of the anxiety. Now, your question is, how do you get better at it? Only way you get good at communication is the way you get good at anything. 3 things: repetition, reflection, and feedback. You have to put the reps in. You have to practice. That's why I'm such a big fan of Toastmasters or taking classes, because you get the reps. But you also have to reflect. If I just keep doing the same thing over and over again and it's not serving me, then I'm not helping myself. There's that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So you have to reflect. At the end of every day, before I go to bed, I spend 30 seconds to think about my communication. And I say, what's one thing I did today that was positive in terms of my communication? What's one thing I did that I'd like to strengthen or improve? And then on every Sunday, I spend about 10 minutes going back through the week and I start looking for patterns and I start saying, okay, this week I'm going to try this. It doesn't take a lot of time, but that's how we get better. Everybody who runs an organization as a leader, et cetera, at the end of every one of your meetings, I challenge you to dedicate 30 seconds where you, as a team, talk about the quality of the communication, not what was said. We're not rehashing what was done.
Yes.
I might say, David, it was lovely when you paraphrased what so-and-so said. It really helped get us back on track. So we're reflecting. And then finally, feedback. You need trusted others to give you feedback. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. And so if you do repetition, reflection, and feedback, all of a sudden it becomes second nature. You get better at it and it becomes self-reinforcing because if you communicate clearly and concisely and well, people will pay more attention. They'll act on more what you say. And all of a sudden you've got this positive feedback loop going.
I love that. I love that. I love also the fact that you are really human and normal in the sense of saying, oh, you need 30 seconds or at the end of the week, 10 minutes. Because many people say, oh, yes, you have to sit down for half an hour at the end of the day. It's like, who has that? But some people do, but then they have obviously have some of the responsibilities the rest of us do. So when you're in the flow, you've been practicing it, you're trying it out for real. One of the important skills and capabilities is listening, of course. And the challenge of when you are either over-prepare or you're having anxiety or both is that you either listen to work out when to interrupt or you listen for what you want to hear. How do you listen properly and attentively when your brain's whirring away thinking about what to say next?
Yeah, so you have to break that cycle. I have a colleague who said, oh, listening, that's what I do when I'm waiting my turn to speak, right? And that's the wrong attitude, right? So we are not good listeners, fundamentally. We listen for the top line, not the bottom line. And because of that, we then start judging, evaluating, rehearsing, etc. So we need to listen for the bottom line, not the top line. And when I listen for the bottom line, I listen more deeply. And there are 3 techniques I talk about in the book. I borrow these from a colleague of mine. His name is Collins Dobbs. He uses this approach, which is different from listening, for helping people with conflictual situations. But the 3 principles are pace, space, and grace. We need to slow down. To listen well, you have to move slowly. Many of us have so much going on that slowing down the pace really can help. I believe the most precious commodity we have in the world today is attention. And the best way to maximize our attention is to slow down. So we slow the pace down. We then have to give ourselves space. And sometimes this is just physical space. I have to get to a place where I can actually hear you. If I'm at a loud restaurant or at a sporting event, move to a place where you can hear. But more importantly, it's mental space. I have to allocate space to focus. So slow down, focus, and then grace is give yourself permission to listen not just to what is said, but how it is said. The tone with which it is said, the context in which it is said, all of that gives you insight to the nuance of what might be going on. I use this one example all the time to make this clear. Imagine, David, you and I come out of a meeting and you say, Matt, what do you think? Well, at the top line, I'm like, oh, David wants feedback. Well, David, here are all the things you did wrong. Here are all the things you could do better. But had I noticed, you spoke a little more quietly. You came out the back door. You paused before you asked. Maybe what you really wanted was not feedback, but you wanted support. And by me itemizing all the things you did wrong, I actually did damage to that moment and our relationship. So listening deeply for the bottom line, give yourself a little pace, space, and grace, and all of a sudden you're listening better. This is hard to do. My wife gets upset with me every time I teach listening skills because she's like, you're not practicing what you teach. We all need to still continue to work on this.
There's feedback right there. I know the feeling daily, hourly. I guess it's also trusting yourself to be comfortable with that space and also being in an environment where, especially more mercenary, challenging corporate environments, where actually some people can see that as hesitation.
Yeah.
or not being energetic or pacey. Whereas actually by doing it, you can either listen better, of course, and or make a better contribution going forward.
I was simply going to say that we know from research into status and power that speaking more slowly and taking longer pauses actually are seen as more powerful. So that pausing that you do, and we might feel like, oh my goodness, I have to respond right away. But in fact, the pause actually says something. And there are also ways to buy yourself time if you need to listen, and there are ways to demonstrate listening. So I might ask a clarifying question, which helps me. The goal of listening is fidelity. It's the F word I like to talk about. If my goal is to try to get accurately from what you're thinking into my brain, I need to slow down. I need to clarify so I can get better insight. And then I can also paraphrase what I heard you say to demonstrate I heard you. And you can correct me. You can say, no, what I really meant was this. So by taking the pause, by asking follow-on questions, by paraphrasing, you're demonstrating that you're listening. And that is often respected by people. It's like, no, he's not just, thinking random thoughts. He's actively listening. And that actually confers benefit to your credibility, to your authenticity, and ultimately to your relationships that you form.
Some of the people who have authority misuse it and not only have clever or learned communication styles in the way you described, but also you invoke a huge amount of emotion in what they say, sometimes even following through to bullying. How do you deal with people in the moment, in these spur of the moment situations, not only take you off guard, but come with a lot, come to you with a lot? It could be harsh words, red face, just full of negative energy, difficult emotions. And the reason I mention that is, in some of the, for some people, working through a sort of method is fine, and they need to practice it in the way you described. But when you have so much heat around it, they lose it because they feel threatened or frightened. How do you deal with that in those difficult situations?
It certainly is difficult. You're absolutely right. So a couple things. One, when somebody is hot and spicy at you, a challenging question or negative constructive feedback, instead of getting defensive and retreating, it is better, I think, to be collaborative and open. So when somebody shares something with me, I look for where are there parts of agreement? Where is there something that we hold in common? And then I try to target that and maybe even name it. If somebody is diametrically opposed to my point of view, and they ask me a question that clearly demonstrates that, the one thing that we have in common in that moment is we both care about the topic we're discussing. And I can start there. And I can build a bridge to that. I could say, we disagree on how to resolve this issue, but we agree that this is a problem. And I look forward to collaborating and learning from you, and hopefully you from me, so that we can take this approach. So looking for the yes and in those circumstances can fundamentally change how it feels. And it's hard because when somebody does that, our natural inclination is to retreat. Similarly, I can shut some of that down by using a paraphrase. Paraphrasing to me is an amazing tool. It's like a Swiss Army knife. I can use it for so many things. But when somebody starts bloviating or taking us down a path that's counter to what I want, I simply highlight something of value they've said and I pull it back. I might say, that point about cost is actually really important. And in fact, the next item on our agenda talks about funding. So I've politely taken the floor away from the person in that moment in the best way I know how. I've said, I've heard you, and I take value in this one little piece of what you've said, but now we're going to go talk about this over here. So there are things we can do when things get hot and heavy that can help us feel less threatened and move the conversation forward.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I remember one CEO I worked with, if she felt heard in the paraphrasing or other ways of doing it, she would actually be able to riff, change her perspective and so on.
Yeah.
If, however, the first response to her comment or statement or question was effectively a hand in the face, no, I disagree, taking the alternative perspective, like volcanoes. And some people really didn't get it. You sort of think, she doesn't like it, move on, you can try it. And so there is something about, especially for more senior people, as you say, replaying, reflecting on those moments and really asking people who perhaps have a different perspective to say, okay, how would you have done it differently? What else could I have tried? As opposed to having this is the way I do it sort of formula. The other aspect, Matt, around connection is around storytelling. I mean, it's in vogue. It's been in vogue for years and decades. How many articles are written on the subject? However, if you ask people around them, who is a really good storyteller as a way of not only in sort of formal presentations, but also as a way of responding in these moments, people tend to say, I'm not so sure. They're either anecdotes or they're just showing off. Tell me about your views on the power and the use of storytelling in these situations.
So storytelling is really powerful for sure. Our species, way before we had PowerPoint, I say with tongue in cheek, but before we had the written word, the way we conveyed information was through story. In the writing of my book, I interviewed lots of neuroscientists, which was fascinating to me. And many of them, all of them said that our brains are wired for story. When you tell a story, you spin up so many of our neural systems to get engaged. So telling stories is fascinating. In fact, when you tell stories, people's brain waves actually sync up. So much so that it can be hard to tell who's the storyteller versus who's the listener. There's this congruence that happens. And so we are wired for story. So telling a story that's concise, clear, and relevant is really, really important to getting information across. We will remember story far better than we remember lists or data or other things, because part of it is who we're wired to be. Now, we want these stories to be authentic. We want them to be concise and clear. We want them to be on point. But it is important, though, for us to just think about how could we convey this information in story. Story, to me, boils down to a couple ingredients. It has to be relevant, it has to be concise, and it has to be structured. If you do those things, then you create an engaging story. And a story that's engaging captures attention and builds memory. So I think everybody should think about the stories they need to tell.
Why do so many people struggle with them then? Because everything you said, I agree with. I'm nodding now, and I've been nodding in my head. But so many people struggle with them. Either they don't use them, or they go off on let me tell you, once upon a time, 10 minutes later, we're all sort of nodding off. But why do people either avoid them or just practice them badly?
Well, I don't think we ever get taught effectively how to tell stories. I mean, if you take a literature class, you'll deconstruct a story, but we aren't actually taught. So part of it is we just have to learn some of the foundational principles. In the strategic communication class I teach at Stanford's Business School, we spend time talking about how do you craft a story, and our students craft stories. We have them tell stories so that they get used to it. So part of it is doing it. If you want to be a better storyteller, you have to start observing other people and telling the stories they tell. I happen to love stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedians are often very good storytellers. Yes. And when you start dissecting what they're doing, you see that they weave in emotion, that they bring in detail, that they bring you into it by making it inclusive or saying things like, as you know, or you might have experienced this. So just becoming a conscious consumer of the stories that we take in can help us begin to appreciate what goes into a good story. And then we have to practice it. And just like anything, we have to iterate. The first time you tell a story, it might not be great, but the second or third time it gets a little better. So we have to realize that stories are important, that we need to make them audience-centric, concise, and structured. And in so doing, we can become better at it.
Are all the techniques you're talking about now and you've written about in your book, are they mostly for people who are either underconfident or introverted? Or what do you say to the people who are extroverted, the people who are not shy and get their energy from being around people? Are the messages relevant to them too?
I absolutely think so. I think all of us can hone and develop our communication. We're coming at it from different angles, right? So somebody who's specifically phobic or nervous, either by disposition or experience, they certainly are going to get value out of the methodology and just doing the work. Those who are extroverted run into a lot of problems too. Extroverts tend to speak first, think second, so they might not tailor their message. Yeah. They might take us on a journey of the discovery of what they're saying while they're saying it, so it can be very meandering. So there's a lot that we can do regardless. I mean, I am an extreme extrovert, and I benefit from the work that I do and the research that I do. it helps me. So I absolutely think that all of us, introvert, extrovert, phobic, non-phobic, experienced or not experienced, one of the true joys I've had in releasing this book and talking about this so much is I have had people who are very seasoned speakers. I mean, they're on the circuit. That's what they do. Come to me and say, thank you so much. My speaking is better because of the tools I learned. And so these are people who are very experienced taking benefit from it. And similarly, I have people who are very phobic and nervous saying that they take benefit. So I think it can help everybody. Where you find that value, I think changes and is different, but you can find value.
It's fascinating you talk about speakers there, because I know and have come across many keynote speakers who are incredibly impactful, almost natural on stage, although clearly they're not. They've practiced it. When they come off stage, gosh, they struggle with small talk and the surprising moments.
Isn't that so funny? Yes.
And it happens all the time, and actually can be quite damaging to their brand, because they portray a persona. You or somebody else wants to then have a chat about it afterwards, and they've either expended all their energy or actually you realize it's so manufactured. So there's a lot of keynote speakers who I think should read and use your
that
book.
point you just brought up. Two prominent keynote speakers have said, thank you so much for the advice and guidance you've given on small talk, for that very reason, as they feel very uncomfortable and disingenuous. And people have said that they sound different, like they're a different person. So yes, being authentic and being yourself is critical. And second, be congruent. So you're the same person presenting, leading a meeting, and small talk. Absolutely. I think one of the biggest compliments we can give a communicator is that you sound the same in all the different circumstances you're in. And by that, I don't mean you're not revealing emotion, et cetera, when appropriate, but that's who you are versus, that's the presentation version of yourself. And that's
that's such a great point.
Yeah.
That's such a great point. And what about the perfectionists amongst us? Perhaps trying to think of the analogy, the classical musician who strives for perfection and then is encouraged to play some jazz. And I've seen that play out sometimes well, but most often not. But there are many perfectionists who go around and then they'll want to, literally script out situations, role play them to death. Yeah. What do you say to them? How do they get more comfortable with imperfection?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of Yo-Yo Ma. I think Yo-Yo Ma is an amazing cellist and a musician. And he has a quote, and I'm going to botch it up, this is not a direct quote, but he essentially says that the music doesn't come alive for him until he makes his first mistake. And in that, I find two things fascinating. One, that Yo-Yo Ma makes mistakes, and two, that he embraces them. And I think that's true for all of us, is that there is something that's alive in that connection and in that moment. Because when I am playing something that is scripted, when I am reciting a memorized presentation, I am not present. The example I use is all the people who go to the Grand Canyon or some amazing place, and all they do is take pictures of it. They don't actually experience it. They only have the pictures of it, right? And in some ways, when I'm delivering a memorized speech, that's what I'm doing. I'm reciting the picture for you rather than the connection of what's happening in the moment. So I understand where that comes from. We want to do it right. We feel exposed, and it feels safe to have the memorized, scripted way of doing it. Now, the reality is, at a neuroscience level, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice. Your brain only has so much bandwidth. It's like a computer. It's not a perfect analogy, but if you have lots of windows open on your laptop or lots of apps open on your phone, each one of those windows or apps is performing less well because of the other ones being open. So if I am constantly judging and evaluating what I'm saying against that memorized script, it actually means I have less bandwidth to actually connect and get my point across. So I have the audacity to tell my Stanford students to maximize mediocrity. And David, you should see their jaws drop, because they're just like,
mediocrity?
What? What do you mean? Yeah, right, exactly. But here's the logic in that is, if you just strive to get it done, just answer the question, just give the feedback, just respond in small talk, you actually free up the cognitive resources to do it really, really well. So it is in the freeing ourselves up to just do what needs to be done, to just answer the question, to just connect, we actually free up bandwidth. So my full saying that I tell my students is maximize mediocrity so you can achieve communication greatness. This is hard. It takes a leap of faith, but once you try it in low stakes situations, all of a sudden you realize, there's a pathway here. For those who are perfectionists, this is really hard. But what I try to get people to see is the goal, to be a perfect communicator is to mean that you are connecting completely. And when you change that perfection from saying, I have to say it exactly right to I have to connect completely, then all of a sudden they can make that mindset shift and actually do what we're talking about.
It's that emphasis on connection, because many perfectionists have their own version of perfection and it's in their head, irrelevant to what's going on around them.
Can I give you a quick example? I talk about it in the book. I learned this game from a colleague of mine. His name's Adam Tobin. He's an improv expert. And he taught me this game called Shout the Wrong Name. And in playing this game, you simply point at things in the room you're in and you just call them anything but what they are. For many people, it's really hard because we're trained, a window's a window, a door's a door. But it can be fun to call it something different. I played this with my students, and I had a student once who was pointing at a chair and nothing was coming out of his mouth. And I went up to him and I said, "What's going on?" And he looked at me and says, "I'm not being wrong enough." Now, I want you to think about that for a second. I gave no rubric on wrongness. And I said, "Tell me more." And he said, "Well, I was going to call the chair a cat, but a cat has 4 legs and a chair has 4 legs. And sometimes a cat sits in a chair." Do you hear all of these machinations he's going through? All he had to do is say any word but chair, but he was judging and evaluating. And we all do this to some degree. And a perfectionist does this to the 10th degree. And so we need to let go of some of that. And the game, as silly as it is, highlights just how much of that we do. And once people recognize it, then they can make the change. And so that's where something like improv can really help, because it frees you. And for a moment, you're like, that's crazy. I can call that a cat, or I can call that a door. It doesn't matter. But we have this innate, I have to get it right.
This overall theme of freeing yourself, freeing your mind so you're more able to riff and connect is a big one. Before we go on to a few questions about you, I always do that in podcasts. Don't worry, not too personal. A few quick fire questions. And I want you to give us one tip, only one out of all the things you can do. So imagine a boss bumps into you and asks what you're doing, or perhaps what you think of a big issue she or he is grappling with. And you think, well, where did that come from? Well, what tip would you give somebody?
Whenever you're put in those circumstances, immediately say, what's the bottom line of my response? And then build your response from there. And I would encourage people to put it in a structure. So I would say the bottom line to the question of what do I think he should do? Yes or no? What do I think she should, how should she approach it? Bottom line, then structure my response.
And if you just finished your presentation in a big meeting and you prepared a whole series of responses to question, and another question comes completely out of the blue on a completely lateral perspective, where would you start your response? What would you do?
I would probably ask a clarifying question to have the person help me connect it to what I've said. So when something seems out of the blue to me, I always assume that I don't see the connection. And there might be an obvious connection and I just don't see it. So I would come back with a question to the person and say, help me understand how that feature relates to the cost structure I was just talking about. And the person might say, oh, A equals B. And I go, oh, well, of course. Or they might say, well, you know what? It really doesn't. Let me rescind the question, or maybe I'll frame the question differently. So I would ask a question for clarification to help me better understand.
And lastly, if you're at a networking event in person, and you suddenly had to introduce yourself, perhaps earlier than you were expecting, perhaps somebody bumped into you. What's a good way of introducing yourself?
I have a structure for introducing myself that I really like. Start with something you're passionate about or something that you really are focusing on, and then say your name. So many of us say, my name is Matt, and I'm a professor at Stanford's Business School. Instead, I like starting by saying, I'm somebody who's passionate about communication. My name's Matt Abrahams, and I teach at Stanford's Business School. By having that phrase, that sentence, it does several things. One, it allows me to emote. I cannot emote around my name, but I can say, I'm passionate about communication.
Yes,
and you have a feeling right away about me. Maybe a good one, maybe a bad one, but you have a feeling. And think of this. Many of us are in environments where people speak different languages. And if I have an accent, and the very first thing I tell you is my name with my accent, that can be overwhelming. Our brains are really good at parsing people's accents. But if it's the first thing we see, our brain can get, oh, that's how that person speaks. And then they miss the name. So if I say a statement first, you go, oh, that's how he speaks. Then when I say my name, all of a sudden you can connect to it. So I love just a short, pithy phrase that conveys something that's important to me. Then I say my name.
Love that. And when Matt's having his best day, when you're smashing it out of the park, everything's on fire, What one single practice helps you do that?
Slowing down. I am somebody who is prone to moving very quickly. I do lots of things. And if I slow down and connect and reflect, I do better. And it is my nature to move fast. And I have been working for a long time in my life to slow down. But slowing down is the single biggest thing for me. The second is to make sure everything I say is relevant. So by slowing down and making sure I'm taking the other person's perspective, that's what leads to a lot of success.
As you've slowed down already in the last minute or so, a more philosophical question. What impact are you looking to have on the world around you?
I believe it is fundamentally important to hear from everybody so we can take advantage of diversity of thought and experience. And if I can help people feel more comfortable and confident sharing their points of view, then I have been successful. It is very easy in our world today to be overcrowded by whoever's speaking the loudest and the longest. And I think that's doing a disservice to our organizations, to our relationships. And so I would like to help empower people to have their voices contributed to the dialogue. And that to me is success.
Gosh, that's eloquent and that's inspiring. And Matt, you all both of those, and what a fabulous conversation. I've learned a lot. I loved your riffs, your analogies, and so many practical tips that I can take away and the listeners can take away. So I'm incredibly grateful to you. And the fact that this is all about being true to yourself, being closer to yourself, being connected with other people, being freer is rather empowering. It's a very positive message and obviously has the impact that you just described just there. If people want to, and I'm sure they will want to find out more about you, your book, your works, where should they go online to do so?
Well, David, thank you for the conversation. You ask really thoughtful questions and you are a very good communicator and listener yourself. The best place to go to find stuff about me is mattabrahams.com. You'll find the book, the podcast I host, Think Fast, Talk Smart. And the other place is I'm a big fan of LinkedIn, and you'll find me there as well. And I'd love to connect to people via the website, the podcast, or through LinkedIn.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Matt, thank you ever so much again. And that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Do check out the other episodes in the series that complement this one. Sign up to the YouTube channel, to the podcast. If you're feeling especially generous, give us a nice rating. And Matt, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you.